So yeah, I'm Carolyn. I'm a front-end developer based in Berlin, but yeah, I'm from Seattle, Washington originally, so that's what this tattoo is. And before venturing into programming for a living, I was a technical writer, and then even before that, a journalist. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. So today I'm here to talk about how you can humanize your docs. And for the sake of this talk, we're going to focus on external-facing documentation, so the information that will describe your product to its users. All right, let's get going. I want to start with a single question. Why do we even write documentation? Is it because our competitors have it, or because someone told us to do it? Or is it because we want to help the people using our products accomplish their goals? Writing documentation is often an afterthought. It's something that we just kind of get done. But what if we decided to approach documentation with the same care and consideration that we give the features we ship? Those questions were originally posed back in 2006 and lay the foundation for what we now know as use case-driven documentation. So use case-driven documentation derives from the idea of goal-driven documentation, both of which were coined and made popular by Tyner Blaine. And it works like this. Make your users' goals the focal point of your docs, instead of just, describing interface elements from left to right. And to illustrate this, and why having learning and goal-centric documentation is essential, Tyner Blaine uses the example of a power drill. So if we were to document this drill the same way that most document software, we'd end up with something like this. So we would learn how to adjust the speed of the drill, how to change the direction of the drill, and how to change the drill bit. So now you know how to operate a drill, but not actually how to accomplish anything with it. And these are examples of reference documentation. Reference documentation is information-oriented. They describe the machinery, and they're usually accurate and complete. But if we reshape our perspective just a bit and focus on what it takes to do the job and not just use the tool, we could end up with something like this. How to drill a hole in a flat surface, whether it's wood or metal. How to select the right screw for fastening items. How to stir paint with your drill. Suddenly, the documentation is helping us to achieve our goals. And these same principles from that drill example can apply directly to our products as well. We aren't necessarily writing documentation to teach someone how to work our software. We're trying to rather teach them how to achieve their goals and solve their problems using our software. So let's apply this idea to something maybe a little bit more applicable for our industry, say Slack. So Slack is a cloud-based set of team collaboration tools and services. And because I know they have a developer portal and thorough documentation, I crawled their sites for examples. And these are a few of the titles that I found. As expected, they have those information-oriented reference docs. They teach us how to add a bot user to our Slack app, programming those bot users, how to subscribe to event types with their Events API. And that's nice. But perhaps if I'm a first-time Slack user or maybe integrating it into my organization, I'm not really sure how or why I would even need these functions. So this is a screenshot from the same documentation, just a different page. But notice how they're not only giving us use cases, create simple workflows, build bots, but they're also outlining what we can actually accomplish. We can create a simple workflow by integrating interactive components, or we can build a bot to talk with our users or maybe automate tasks. Plus, it points you to those applicable reference documentations that we saw the previous slide. And now that we have, that we understand what use case-driven documentation is, let's create a high-level outline of this idea. Okay, when you want to develop a use case, you typically start with a goal. And then from there, if you're using some sort of use case-driven development or something similar, the rest of your workflow could look something like this. You'll define the functional requirement, you'll design the product, and then you'll implement the feature. So this is called the structured requirements approach. And with an approach like this, we've already solved half the problem, determining what to document. What most documentation is doing, however, is starting at the implementation phase. It's once you've already finished the feature and it works, the docs get done. But what a use case-driven approach is suggesting is that we start here at, maybe you guessed it, the use case. And the beauty of this is that you can design your documentation simultaneously with the features that you're developing. And when we use a structured requirements approach, we've established a framework for defining the problems that our software will solve. And we also can articulate how to solve those problems with use cases. And then those use cases, as I mentioned earlier, define exactly what we need to be documenting. But there are problems with this use case-driven approach. First, it requires a fundamental change in how maybe your organization or you approach documentation and tackle it. It also kind of sounds more like this beautiful ideal and not necessarily something that's in our immediate reality. And those reference docs, the one that just explain what software can do, those are actually why documentation has a pretty bad reputation in our community. Because they tend to be a little bit dry and they leave us wanting more. And honestly, I know this feeling all too well, because even if I used to write technical content for a living, I still had a pretty unsatisfying relationship with documentation over the years. So at the beginning of 2017, and after 2 years of working in tech, I decided to take the dive and actually learn to code. And I knew exactly what I wanted to focus on: JavaScript. But, okay, I don't know how you all felt while you were learning, but for me, it really felt like every day I was asking myself something like, what's going on? In my text editor, in my terminal, no idea. Am I the only one who finds this confusing? Because I knew at the time a lot of front-end developers or other people working with JavaScript, and they seemed to be thriving, while I could barely figure out how to log something. And also, do people actually enjoy this? And will I ever think that building things with JavaScript is fun? Because it felt like in order to do interesting things with JavaScript, you had to understand and use those advanced concepts, and I just wasn't getting it. And the most detrimental part to my learning was actually the documentation I was finding. And these docs were the ones that were supposed to be fueling my learning, and in reality, they were stunting it. More often than not, I felt completely drained after reading docs, and my questions were still left unanswered. And I'm not alone. Documentation is one of the largest pain points for many developers. Just search the term reading docs on Twitter, and you'll notice that most of the tweets are not so positive. So here are a couple that I found. So, hi, I was reading your documentation, and it describes this data in 2 different ways, which is correct. Thank you. The way it works is third completely different description. And Ethan actually told me that this was from a large organization. You might know them. They do a lot of work with space. So just because your organization is large and has resources doesn't mean that it just magically gets better. All right, next one. The process of learning how to write a plugin. 1, read docs. 2, get console log output. 3, read more. 4, try literally anything else. 5, get errors. 6, read more docs. 7, read existing plugin source. 8, notice that it's written completely different to what the docs say. And 9, cry a little. And honestly, I go through the same journey, except the crying comes a little bit earlier. And this one is my personal favorite. Bad documentation is bad. And even after someone asked, if there were no docs, would it be better? Lee still said, deep thoughts. Honestly, yes, because it would waste less of my time. So yeah, people love to hate documentation, but can you really blame them? I mean, I believe that's also on us, the people who are writing the docs, because we don't seem to treat our readers that well. Just look at the term users, for instance. Laura Kalbag, who's a designer and accessibility advocate, explains this well. She says, I tend to not even refer to people as users. I refer to them just as people who use things. She explains that this is because when we say user as a developer, designer, what have you, we're separating ourselves from that person. We turn the people who use our products into this kind of like faraway thing, and we don't necessarily think of them as another human just like us. And that's why, as a technical writer, I needed to constantly remind our devs that, we are writing for humans. And not just that, though. We're writing for humans who don't even want to be reading our documentation in the first place, necessarily. People oftentimes visit docs when they're really frustrated with the software. They're disappointed that they haven't been able to solve the problem on their own, and generally feeling pretty low. And this reality isn't awesome, especially if you are maybe someone who puts a lot of time and care and consideration into your docs. But being aware of these negative feelings that some people might be experiencing is key, because these emotions can frame our reader's perspective, and therefore they should shape the mood of our documentation. Okay, let's take a step back. So what were the issues that I had with the documentation I was finding while learning JavaScript? They were disorienting. So the underlying structure was difficult to follow, and in some cases they weren't accessible, as in I couldn't actually access the docs based on the way they were programmed. They were alienating, so some documentation I read made me feel super isolated afterwards. There were a lot of words or concepts that were just assumed knowledge and never explained, not to mention the use of, gendered or discriminatory language. And finally, they were confusing. It was clear that the developers who were working on these products had a huge depth of knowledge on the subject, but it wasn't translating to me as a brand new user. So let's run through some of these common issues, and I'll show some examples of what not to do, followed by some tools and resources to help us be a little bit better to our readers in our docs. And yes, all of the what not to do examples are from software docs that are live on the web, but I've anonymized them a little, try not to make too many enemies. So, okay, first off, poorly defined structure. So the structure of our docs is important because they shape the learning journey and the overall experience for our readers. And this tweet, and particularly this GIF from Sarah Drasner, describes it well. And not only is navigating from one page after another for an answer annoying, but if the structure is not well defined, then you can lose control of how the reader interprets your work. And this doesn't just apply to how the pages connect with each other, it can also apply to just how the article or tutorial, guide, what have you, is written. So whether it is one particular article or your entire doc app, we can have a mindful structure and have a clear, easy to follow path for our readers. And when in doubt, we can aim for something like this. We can talk about one specific feature, we can go on to explain the use cases, and finally then offer solutions for tooling, integrations, etc. And this covers all your bases. You'll have your information-oriented docs, like explaining the feature. You'll have those goal-oriented docs, like showing use cases that can either inspire your readers or maybe address their needs directly. And then finally, you can suggest other toolings that you can lead your reader to what you think they should be looking at next. Unexpected errors. So have any of you ever read something that just says, like, just run this snippet and you're good to go, and then you run it and it's just like, error? Unfortunately, this is all too common, and when we do get error messages, they tend to look something like this. We have lost connection to our server and disabled editing features. Please verify that you have internet access. And as a user, this literally tells me nothing. All I know is that I need to check my connection, but I'm not really sure why my editing features are disabled. Did my connection go down? Did theirs? I'm not really sure. So let's write our error messages with those users in mind and the people who will be encountering them in our forefront. And so here's a better solution for our mishap earlier. It appears you aren't connected to the internet at the moment. The fields are temporarily locked so that you won't lose any important changes. And this tells you what happened, the fields are locked, why it happened, because you don't have internet access, and its implications. We locked the editing features so that you wouldn't lose any of your changes. We can also consider and address common errors before they even happen. And this helps reassure your users that, mistakes happen, and it can also provide them with options for troubleshooting, or maybe a workaround if you know something's, incomplete. So when you're writing these errors, you want to try to explain what happened, what might happen, and why, and then tell them what to do next. This is a screenshot from the Apple II Basic Programming Manual from, yes, the 1970s. But it tackles the nuances of common user errors quite well, and it explains syntax errors before you even start coding. And this tells us what happened. You got a beep and the syntax error message, why it happened, because you press return, and what to do next. Ignore it. When you're formatting these errors in tutorials, Django Girls is a great resource to reference for how this should look. These notes are scattered throughout the tutorial, and they're enough to be there to be reassuring to people who are running into these errors, but also not so distracting that someone could easily skip by them if they're not applicable. I've also seen that collapsible error messages work pretty well. Foo, bar, and baz. The non-descriptive variable names. So this one stirs up a lot of opinions, and this is because, foo, bar, baz, insert any other three-letter word here. They don't have any context or any sort of indicator to what they could be representing, and therefore our readers are more likely to lose their understanding throughout your piece. So instead, we can use meaningful placeholders and use those as a tool for teaching. In a discussion about this, Ellie Ramirez, who is a UI developer based in London, once said that we can have variable names that are both meaningful and generic, that expose their purpose via their semantics. And she uses the example of an array, and I want to dig into that a bit further. So here's an array named Baz with two items, foo and bar. Say I'm learning what arrays are, or maybe how to work with them. These variables are way too abstract. I don't really understand what's going on here. So instead, we could maybe name our array list of fruits and call the items apple and orange. This is descriptive, and I understand what's going on, but we don't even necessarily need to take it that far. Take W3 Schools, for example. They named the array name, and listed item 1 and item 2. While it's not the most creative, it works a whole lot better than foo, bar, and baz. All right, next we have the issue of insensitive language. And this one's tricky because across nationalities and personalities, the word insensitive can mean a lot of different things. In this case, it will include gendered language, profanity, racial slurs, and anything else that would maybe break a code of conduct. Take this one. If the programmer wishes to uphold the invariant, he must satisfy the function's preconditions. Now, you might think that gendered language is a relatively tame example, but even so, it can have some devastating effects on members of your community and their own sense of belonging within that community. And in software development, we also have these problematic, outdated, mostly racist terms that we are still using even though it's 2018. Terms like master-slave and blacklist, whitelist. So a good rule to follow is that when documenting code, you don't need to be making assumptions about people's race, gender, religion, political orientation, or really anything else that isn't relative to the project. For the previous examples, we can use alternatives like primary and replica, or deny list and allow list. I've also heard block list and safe list works well as well. Not only are these significantly less racist, but they are actually better to describe the purpose via their semantics. But there's so much more than that, than these like 4 words, and I know it can feel a little bit overwhelming, and if you're not really sure, but don't worry, I have a linter for you. So AlexJS catches insensitive and polarizing writing in your Markdown files, and it also suggests helpful alternatives. And you can use it on the command line or as an integration with Atom, Sublime, VS Code, and even Slack. It's also open source, so if you notice that it's not catching something that you're like, oh, that's kind of problematic, then you can, open a pull request as part of Hacktoberfest, maybe. So here are those examples from earlier, but now AlexJS is helping us to catch the words that are maybe better left out of our docs, or at least changed. And you should probably still have like a human read over it, preferably someone from a different demographic than you, but this is a really great start. On a similar note, saying simply or easy. Because really, after fixing a bug or trying to fix a bug for hours, do you really want someone to come up to you and be like, oh, but this is so easy? James Fisher actually opened this year's Write the Docs Prague with a talk on this very topic. And at one point, he searched the word simply on GitHub and found over 92 million references to it in documentation. And here are a few examples. Developing a plugin is simple. The only knowledge necessary to write a plugin is basic command line skills and basic knowledge of the Go programming language. Yes, basic, very simple. Or this one. We simply start parsing an expression, and afterwards, if the next token is a colon and the expression was a simple identifier node, then da-da-da-da-da. And it keeps going. I think it says simply 4 times. So my suggestion is just don't say it. But don't worry, I have a little bit more to offer you than that. WriteGood is another linter for English prose, and it's available as a command line tool, and I believe that someone also recently wrote a VS Code plugin for it. Once it's installed, you can run this command and do a general check of all of your Markdown files. And it automatically flags for words like simply or easily, but you can also write a custom plugin if maybe there are terms that your team uses that you'd rather they not in your docs. For example, I know a team that recently wrote a plugin to scan for the word just. Okay, bloated language. And by this, I mean overly complicated prose that are difficult to understand the first time you read them, or any time you read them. This is particularly for anyone who might have a learning disability or even is just reading in a language that isn't their native tongue, their mother tongue, sorry. All right, need to take a breath for this one. Okay, this approach will work for our specific use case, but we haven't achieved the objective of truly encapsulating the behavior in a reusable way. Now, every time we want the tool positioned for a different use case, we have to create a new component, i.e. essentially another tool, that renders something specifically for that use case. Okay, so that's just 2 sentences, and it's extremely difficult to read and comprehend on the first try. And so we want to choose our language intentionally, and using plain language is crucial for having more inclusive documentation. And while this is like its own conference talk on its own, there is another app/linter that can help us here. So Hemingway Editor is a tool where you can paste your text into, and it'll highlight problematic, complicated words and sentences, and also offer you suggestions and alternatives. In this case, I put in that phrase that we just read earlier, and it identifies the first sentence as as hard to read, yellow. The red is very hard to read. The blue is adverbs that are unnecessary, and then also points out to words in purple that could have a simpler alternative. And when we're doing this, like ours right now is a grade 12, and you want to aim for about a maximum of grade 8, but never worry about the reading level being quote unquote too low, Because as the amazing Ashley Bischoff once said, no one has ever complained that something was too easy to read. And actually, if you want more tangible examples of plain language, you should check out our talk from Frontiers. It is gold. And the final issue that I'll be covering today is that your product just isn't the right fit for whoever's your tool is not the right fit for whoever's reading your docs. And this causes confusion. And I get a lot of questions about this as someone who used to be a technical writer, like, but if I tell people that to not use my product, isn't that bad for business? And honestly, I'm all for being transparent. Because when you know a specific use case doesn't work and you say something about it, you will save people a lot of headaches in the long run. You'll gain trust from the people reading your docs. And yeah, I promise it will not destroy your business in any way. In your introductory materials, for instance, you can remind people to double check that this tool is appropriate for the problem that they're trying to solve. The Reason documentation does this really well. In their converting from JavaScript page, they emphasize that you should really make sure that Reason is going to fit your needs. It also points out that you shouldn't unnecessarily thrash your colleagues over other languages and frameworks, but for the record, always unnecessary. So I hope that I've given you, maybe a new tool to implement or maybe a new way, something for your documentation checklist. But before I get off the stage, I want to leave you with something that I learned during my time as a technical writer. So about a year ago, I was working at a company called Contentful in Berlin. And when I first read through their style guide, there was something that immediately struck me. At the very beginning, it says, "We aim for accuracy and consistency." Okay, sure, this is most documentation, hopefully. But what really got me was what came next. More importantly, we aim to be honest, helpful, and human. Honest in that we communicate the pros and cons, because in doing so, we build trust. Helpful because, we want our users to succeed. I mean, their success is ultimately our success. And human, we want to feel familiar and approachable for our readers. And I mean, after all, like you and anyone else reading or writing your docs are humans too. Thank you.